From inside the MASN newsroom, it is the MASN All Access Podcast, brought to you by Marymount University. Visit MaryMountSaints.com to learn more about our student athletes and programs today. Baseball is back. You heard right. It's coming back in a 60-game format. We're going to talk about what it means for the Orioles and what it'll look like. The strangest season, to be sure, of our lifetimes is just around the corner. Paul Mancano and Brendan Mortensen here with you. We're going to have Jim Palmer on, MASN broadcaster and Orioles great. But first, definitely our premier guest is Brendan Mortensen, who joins us now via Zoom. Brendan, we had to get you out of the way before we get, to the lesser guest, which is Hall of Famer Jim Palmer.
Right. You have the Orioles legend, and then you have Jim Palmer on later. I mean, it just makes sense. It just makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Brendan, we are going to have a strange season. This is undoubtedly going to be the weirdest season of our lifetimes, I think. A 60-game season. It's assumed no fans in the stands. The agreements were reached in terms of health and safety protocols yesterday between MLB and MLBPA. We're still waiting to see exactly what the schedule will look like in terms of what games will be played on what days, but we do know some things right off the bat. 40 games are going to be played against division opponents for the Orioles, so against the AL East teams, and then 20 games within their region in the NL, so that's NL East teams. 6 of those 20 games will be played against the rivals, which would be the world champion Washington Nationals, and then the other 14 games will be split up amongst the other 4 NL East teams. This is going to be so bizarre in so many ways. And I think that the reaction last night of finally getting baseball back after the long-awaited return was a little bit tepid, only because, 1, I think it took so long, and 2, we still got to see if this is going to go through. We still don't have all the information. Teams have not reported. They're going to report in a week. We're still getting cases added to the list every day in terms of positive tests. I think it was a little bit tepid, but that being said, this is the most positive and forward step that we have seen to baseball coming back in 2020.
Well, quite frankly, it was 3 months of just really ugly negotiations. I mean, the Major League Baseball as a whole just really did not look very good in all of this. And I think people are just really excited to have baseball back in any form. And like you were saying, it's really interesting. There's just so much up in the air that we still really don't know. I mean, we were talking before the podcast, just like, oh, do you know what is happening with this? Do you know what is happening with this? Because there's so many question marks still. But what we do know is that it's going to be a very, very interesting season. Like you said, I mean, it's only 60 games, and that's going to lead to a lot of discrepancies in what you might normally see out of a much longer season. Like the Nationals last year, we all know started 19-31. That team's not making the playoffs in a 60-game season. They go on to win the World Series last year. So you can see a lot of differences in this season, and we could see some really crazy stuff.
Well, and speaking of the crazy stuff, I think it's fair to start asking some questions when it comes to the Orioles. I'm just going to be the guy that asks the questions today, because I think this is all new territory, and I think it's fair to ask these questions about, 1, let's start off with this, Brendan. 60-game season, could the Baltimore Orioles make the playoffs? It's not an expanded playoff field. We're going to still have 10 playoff teams, but could they do it? I mean, 60 games, I was looking through their schedule last year. I could not find a 60 games. There was no 60-game stretch in which they were over 500. There was no 60-game stretch I could find that even did not include at least a 6 or 7 game losing streak. But that being said, this is going to be a new team from last year. Could they do it? Could we get a 60-game Orioles playoff team, Brendan?
Listen, I want to be the optimist here.
You're going to rain on everybody's
The Orioles, parade. I'm going to rain a little bit. The Orioles just got about the toughest draw that you could get. First off, you're in the AL East, in which the Orioles were 24-52 last season. They go 2-17 against the Yankees, 22-35 against everyone else. I think the Red Sox are probably the only team in the AL East that's going to be a little bit worse. The Yankees got better, the Rays got better, and the Blue Jays got better. So that's a really tough division. that you're playing 40 of your 60 games in. And then you've got the other 20 against the regional teams from the National League. And that's probably the toughest division you could get too. You've got the NL East, which has the defending World Series champions that came in second in the division last season. You've got the Braves, who were 97-65 last year, the Nationals, the Mets, who were still 10 games above 500, and the Phillies, who were the second worst team in the division at 81-81. And then, of course, you've got the Marlins, who are at the bottom of the division, and that could be some wins, but I don't know. I'm not seeing a ton of wins on the schedule for the Orioles.
Yeah, the path to a playoff team, because people were asking, how many wins would a team have to make the playoffs in a 60-game season? In terms of win percentage, if you prorate that to 60 games, the worst team typically in baseball that makes the playoffs every year still has an over 500 winning percentage, and you prorate that to 60 games, and you got to win about 33 games. ESPN's Dave Schoenfield did the math, and you have to have at least 33 wins. And the other thing is, I think when you have a surprise team make the playoffs every year, they still have to buy at the deadline. So they still, it's a surprise team because of who they have out of the gate, and then oftentimes by the end of the season, they look pretty different because they said, all right, we're good enough to get in the race. Let's buy at the deadline. We weren't expecting to. The MLB is going to have a trade deadline this year. It's going to be August 31st, so they're going to have played a little bit over halfway through the season, considering opening day is going to be July 23rd or 24th. So my next question, Brendan, is what you would have to see in the first 30-some games from the Orioles to convince you to buy it. Is there literally anything that the Orioles could do in those first 30-some games by August 31st to buy at the deadline?
Well, if you're a few games above 500 and think that you have a chance in the playoffs, sure, why not buy at the deadline? But like I was saying, I think it's a really tough schedule for Baltimore, and I'm not so confident that they're going to be in that position by the deadline. But if you are in the midst of a playoff push, there's no reason why you wouldn't buy at the deadline. But also, I think the trade deadline is going to be pretty interesting as well, because are you really going to trade guys in a pandemic? That's my question with the trade deadline, is relocating somebody and all that just seems very, very complicated. So I think teams might be a little more hesitant to buy at the deadline. But I think another scenario too is maybe if you're looking at a guy who is going to be a free agent after the 2020 season, and maybe if you're Baltimore and you find a guy who you might want to sign and think if you trade for him, you can re-sign him, then maybe you go after somebody. But I don't know. I don't see a lot of scenarios where the Orioles are buyers at the deadline rather than sellers.
I can't imagine Mike Elias trading anybody he considers to be part of the future at all at the deadline, nor should he, just because it's not worth it for 30-some games and a chance to make the playoffs. To me, the only kind of moves you would make at the deadline are either one, you sell, and then, to be honest, I don't know what you could sell. Maybe you could sell a Michael Givens, but you're selling him to a team when saying, all right, here you go. You're going to get at most about 15 games of Michael Givens at most. So to me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make many trades, period. But I can't see Mike Elias buying it all. But the other thing is, like, if you do have a legitimate chance of making the playoffs, is it worth it? Is it worth what would that mean for the Orioles to make the playoffs for the first time since 2016? Would it count the same as it would in any other year? Because you have fewer games and you also have no fans in the stands. I would say almost if you did have fans in the stands, just to be able to see a playoff game again at Camden Yards, I think would almost be worth it, just because of how much life that would inject into the fan base. But considering you're not going to have fans in the stands, and also people will throw it out because of the small sample size, I think that the playoffs might mean slightly less than they would in other years. That being said, I think it would be incredibly fun. I think it would be a raucous time, and it would be so much fun because it would be a team that was not supposed to be there in a year that was not supposed to be there a year, and they somehow make the playoffs just because of these crazy circumstances.
And I don't know how much a playoff game per se would matter to the Orioles, but I think it's a very good opportunity for you to look at some of the guys that you have on the current roster. We know about the farm system. We know there's a lot of top prospects that are going to be coming up within the next few years. But this gives you a chance to look at some of the guys you have right now and see if any of them are going to be cornerstones moving forward. I mean, you've got guys up already like Austin Hayes that have already proven themselves to be a piece moving forward. But are there any other guys that are going to stick around for the long term? You look at guys like Hanser Alberto, Anthony Santander, Rio Ruiz, Dwight Smith. I mean, are these guys that are going to have a real opportunity here, just like they did last year, to have good seasons, to keep proving themselves and try to stay a part of this Orioles rebuild moving forward. And I think if you're looking at kind of the goals of the season, if you're Baltimore, I think that's a big one.
And, any kind of, for them to even be in the race, you mentioned the uphill battle that they would face. And I still think it's a non-zero chance, but there's a very, very, very slim chance that they make the playoffs or even finish above 500. If they were to be in the race, it would have to be on the backs. You'd have to get like a magical return to form season from Chris Davis. You'd have to get probably like a Cy Young type season from John Means. You'd have to maybe see a guy like an Austin Hayes, a Ryan Mountcastle come up and light the world on fire. You would have to have so many things go right for them to even be above 500. Not impossible, but again, very slim. But that brings me to the next point, which is, do the Orioles have any legitimate chance to win any of the individual awards? Because it's going to take all of those things going right for them to make the playoffs, but it would only take one of those things going right for them to be in the conversation to win an individual award. I did a little bit of research into the best 60-game stretch last year from some guys. Saw 2.38 ERA from Michael Givens. John Means had a 2.80 ERA in the first 60 or so games when he was a little bit out of the bullpen, a little bit mostly starting. And Hanser Alberto had a 341 average in his best 60-game stretch. And then Renato Nunez had 19 homers in his best 60-game stretch. Would any performance from one of those guys or somebody that we're not mentioning, could any of those guys be in the conversation for a Cy Young for an MVP by season's end?
Well, I think in 60 games, anything can happen. I mean, you talk about some of those stretches, and those are Cy Young MVP-like numbers.
Yeah.
And so I think there could be a handful of guys on this roster that could all of a sudden have a great stretch and get themselves in that conversation. I think John Means, I don't know if he's a Cy Young caliber pitcher right now. It'll just be his second year in the league. But certainly a stretch where he's in the, even mid twos to upper twos, if he's getting high strikeout numbers. And the tough thing going against John Means as well is that I don't know if he's going to pick up a ton of wins. I mean, even last year he was fantastic, but still only had, I think, 10 wins on the season. So that's certainly going to be something working against him. But I think somebody like Hanser Alberto, like Rio Ruiz, if they had a good 60-game stretch, they could do something. I mean, Austin Hayes, when he came up last year, had a really good stretch. I think he could also be in a conversation for maybe a Gold Glove in center field.
Yeah,
but definitely. I know Byron Buxton in Minnesota would have something to say about that. But I think there's a chance, and I think there's more of a chance than in years past, just because it's a shortened season and you're not going to have kind of those regression to averages that you might have. A hot streak could be almost a quarter of the season.
Yeah.
So, any of those numbers that kind of seem like they're too good to be true are going to take up a much longer chunk of the season than they normally would.
The only thing to that is if you do get a great 60-game stretch out of one of your guys, that means obviously somebody else in the league is also going to have some amazing 60-game stretch, So like numbers that, in theory, numbers that might win the MVP or the Cy Young this year might not be good enough, as crazy as that is. You might get these crazy skewed statistics. I don't think you're going to see anybody hit 400, but like if Hanser Alberto hits 341, yeah, in 162 games, absolutely, that's crazy and amazing. But odds are, if Hanser Alberto's hitting 341, that means in 60 games, Mike Trout's hitting 390. You could get another crazy 60-game stretch from somebody else. The other thing is, I think typically, Cy Young does not have to do with team overall performance. So I think that would be your best chance of winning an individual award or a Rookie of the Year. If Ryan, the other one that we haven't discussed is what if Ryan Mountcastle comes up and demolishes, in 60 games, he makes the team out of spring training 2.0 and he crushes and he plays a solid outfield wherever he's thrown. So I think that's a legitimate chance. MVP, I don't think really anybody can win it. One, because Trey Mancini would probably be their best hope, and we're not going to see him in 2020. And the other thing is you would have to at least be a 500 team, I think, to have an MVP candidate on your team. And he would have to outslug everybody else in the league, including a Mike Trout and all the games. You would still have to outperform all the game's best hitters, plus some fluky performance that you might get from somebody else.
Right. And Trout is kind of the anomaly there because he's been a consistent MVP candidate on a team that has not had a lot of success.
Yeah.
And I think if you're somebody on the Orioles that's going for that MVP race, you have to have an unbelievable season if the Orioles aren't picking up a lot of wins. And Trout kind of has that category covered at the moment in terms of, being great on a not great team. So you've got to just have an unbelievable year in Baltimore.
So that kind of brings us to the next point about Rookie of the Year and how the Orioles might handle their prospects, because we don't have answers yet to a lot of questions. One of them being, how much service time would guys get if they play 20 games, if they play 30 games, if they play the full season? Typically, if you're going to play the full season, you're going to get a full year's worth of service time. But if you play less than that, are you going to get a full year's worth of service time? And the Orioles have some guys right on the brim that they might not want to give a full year's service time to. Ryan Mountcastle probably being the most important name. So we can't answer those questions yet. I think we're going to have to discuss that down the road, but it's an interesting thing to wonder is, how will the new service time rules affect somebody like a Ryan Mountcastle, a Keegan Aiken, a Dean Kramer, somebody like that they might want to hold off for a year. Because we would still love to see a full season from these guys. And, if they're not getting a full season, if they're not with the big league team, are they in the taxi squad? Are they with those, the 30 or so guys that are off campus, off site, in Norfolk or wherever it's going to be, working out? And is that enough development that Mike Elias and, the front office think, all right, he's got enough work in, he's had enough development to the point where we feel comfortable just keeping him there the entire season?
And it'll be interesting to see too what those minor league guys are going to do. If there's no minor league season, I know there's been talks about possibly having a league in Arizona. We don't know. A lot of things are still up in the air for those prospects, but depending on what Major League Baseball decides to do with the service time, if you can play 40 games and not have it count as a year of service time, I mean, why not call up guys like, your Mountcastles, even maybe your Yusniel Diaz, Dean Kramer, Keegan Aiken, some guys who could get some quality time in the majors, because all of a sudden, 20 games at the beginning of the season didn't matter last year. It wasn't a very good indicator of how your team was going to do going forward. But now 20 games, is a large chunk of the season. So your first 20 games might indicate just where your team is going to go. And if you can get 40 games, however many games it is, out of some guys and not have it count against their service time, then it might be worth it.
Yeah.
But you could also see something like an Arizona league where you can send out a bunch of your top prospects and they can get playing time there, because you've got to get your top prospects run somewhere.
Yeah.
Somewhere, whether it's at the major league level, whether it's at the minor league level. And these guys that are close, I think it would definitely be worth calling them up to the big leagues just to get a little bit of run, because they need to be doing something. You can't just waste a year of these minor league prospects.
And down the line, in the we'll have spring training 2.0 to kind of discuss all this stuff, and we'll see how rosters are going to shake out, because Trey Mancini not playing this year means that there's potentially an open spot in the outfield. We're assuming Chris Davis is still going to be manning first base. Renato Nunez could still be your DH, but the door is suddenly wide open for potentially Ryan Mountcastle to start every day in a position, which is what the Orioles would prefer as opposed to sticking him at DH. So these are all going to be, at least we have some exciting stuff, baseball type stuff to discuss, and we will discuss that over the next few weeks as these players are going to report to camp, hopefully healthy, hopefully in shape, and we're just going to kind of see where we go from here. But Brendan, before we get you out of here, we did promise to the good fans of the MASN All Access Podcast that we were going to go through our 2023 pitching staffs, including our rotation and our bullpen. Let's start with you again. Last week we did our lineups. Let's go to your 5-man rotation for the 2023 Orioles opening day roster.
All right. So my top 3, I think you could really put any of them in the top 3, and I wouldn't argue with you. My top 3 right now is John Means, DL Hall, and Grayson Rodriguez.
Yep.
I put Rodriguez at number 3, Hall at 2, and Means at 1, because Means will be, I think, 30 years old at the start of the 2023 season. And if he continues to have success, there's no reason that he wouldn't be the opening day starter. And then I've got Hall and Rodriguez at 2 and 3, because those guys are probably going to be up around the 2021, 2022 seasons. So, maybe they won't have enough time under their belt to cement themselves as the top guy, but I think they could certainly be, the number 2 and number 3 guys. And then a number 4, number 5, I think there's honestly about 4 or 5 guys that you could throw in as the last 2 starters in the rotation. For right now, I've got Michael Baumann and Keegan Aiken. I have Aiken in there because I think he will probably be called up the earliest out of the guys that you could probably throw in there. And then Baumann, I think, might have the best stuff behind Hall and Rodriguez. So I have him at 4 and 5. But I think you could also make a good argument for Dean Kramer, Alex Wells, Zach Lowther. Any of those guys could really be the number 4 and number 5 starters.
This is my favorite part of this discussion, because we could be sitting here talking about the 2020 opening day starter, but I think we're more likely now to have a debate about the 2023 Orioles opening day starter, because I have Grayson Rodriguez starting right off the bat as the opening day starter. But those top 3, I totally agree with you. In some order, I think the most likely at this point will be John Means, Grayson Rodriguez, DL Hall. I mean, hopefully John Means was not a one-year wonder. It's still a chance. We still do not have a proven track record beyond this 1 year to show that he can be a starter long-term, but that's the hope. We did say we could add 1 free agent, so I have added my 1 free agent in the rotation, and that would be right-handed pitcher Lance McCullers Jr., coming from the Houston Astros. Little ties to Mike Elias going back to their Astros days. Still really young. I think he's going to be a free agent before the 2023 season or 2022 season. You sign him, you add him as a veteran presence to your rotation. And then my last guy went with a different guy. You mentioned Keegan Aiken and Michael Baumann. I have Baumann in the bullpen, and I have Zach Lowther in your starting rotation. I just believe in this guy. I think he's going to be really good. He's a lefty. He just continues to put up numbers everywhere he goes. I think he's a StatCast darling. He's got crazy spin rate, even though he doesn't have amazing stuff. So I'm putting McCullers and Lowther to round out my rotation. Brendan, your bullpen.
The bullpen is tough. I think the bullpen is really hard to predict. But I have a few guys in here, like I said, that I think could either be swingmen, they could be long relievers, and they have a chance to be in that starting rotation. For my long relief pitchers, I have Dean Kramer and Alex Wells. For middle relief, I have Cody Sedlock, Zach Lowther, Blaine Knight, and Dylan Tate.
Okay.
For my setup man, I have Hunter Harvey. And then my closing pitcher is my free agent signing, who is going to be a free agent after the 2020 season, and that's Liam Hendriks, who is the current closer for the Oakland A's. And I think if you're going to spend money somewhere, I think the Orioles have a lot of depth at the starting rotation spot. I think if you're going to spend money, spend it on a closing pitcher. I know Hunter Harvey has a chance to prove himself this season, and maybe it'll eliminate the need to sign a closing pitcher. But I think Liam Hendriks had a fantastic season last year, and I think he would be a really good addition to the bullpen.
I'm not big on spending money in free agency on relievers, just because I think they're too year to year there. Also, isn't Liam Hendriks Australian? Am I thinking of the right guy?
Maybe. I'm not sure.
I think he
That's
is.
possible.
In that case, you also had Alexander Wells, right, in your bullpen?
Yes.
In that case, you would have two of the, I think there are either three or four. I think there are currently two, I think, Australian-born players in Major League Baseball. This is bad podcasting. But I think you currently have two, and Alexander Wells, if he gets called up, could be the third.
Well, listen, I'm just trying to build the team chemistry. I mean, the locker room camaraderie is going to be fantastic.
You have two.
What can I say?
You have two Aussies in the bullpen. That would be pretty cool. I like Hunter Harvey being your setup man. I mean, that 1-2 punch, 8-9 punch, if you will, in the back of the bullpen would be awesome. In terms of my bullpen, I have a lot of the same names. So I have Michael Baumann in the bullpen as opposed to starting rotation like you did. Dean Kramer's in my bullpen. Cody Sedlock, I got him there too, former first-round pick. He's a little bit older, had injury issues, but he's still got, like, great stuff.
Yep.
Alexander Wells is in my bullpen. Hunter Harvey is my closer, and then I'm throwing in Bruce Zimmerman, who was at Norfolk last year. He's a lefty. I got Paul Fry making it all the way to the 2023 roster. Still believe in Paul Fry. I think I think he still has it. Obviously, around a 5 ERA last year, but another lefty. And then long-term, I got Drew Rahm, who was with the Delmarva Shorebirds last year. Another guy, I think he was a fourth-round pick, crushed it in the rotation. I think he could be a great bullpen piece down the line. So that's roughly the 8 or however many guys, 8 guys that I have in my bullpen.
Yeah, the bullpen is just so hard to predict.
You can't predict even 1 year out for the bullpen.
No, not at all.
You had Dylan Tate in there. I like Dylan Tate. I don't know if he's going to make it that far. I mean, he really struggled at a time when they needed anybody in the bullpen last year. That's why, like, we don't have too many guys, I think, making it all the way, between 2020 and 2023, just because that was on a roster that really had a few bright spots. The bullpen had just about none. I mean, Hunter Harvey might have been the only bright spot in that bullpen all of last year. So I think it's a totally remade bullpen, and you're just going to have to see. It's pretty much going to be based on, like, the guys we listed. These are all, like, starters that couldn't quite make it, that we don't think are going to make it, basically.
Right, and I think a big reason for me kind of reconstructing the bullpen completely too is when you look at trade deadlines and teams who are making playoff pushes. Teams need bullpen arms. And I think if the Orioles have good seasons out of their bullpen guys, I think realistically, Baltimore's probably going to be sellers at the deadline for the next few years.
Yeah.
And if you get good seasons out of, a guy like Michael Givens, there's a pretty good chance that he might be a deadline deal. And I think if you have good seasons out of any of your bullpen arms going forward over the next few years, they might be deadline deals. So I think if you're looking at the 2023 season down the line, and hoping for those good bullpen years out of guys, they might be trade pieces and you might be getting some good prospects in returns. So, the bullpen is going to vary a lot. And I think a lot of those guys could get dealt with in the next few years.
Yeah. Well, we got the 2020 season to focus on. We'll have a 2020 season, even though it will be very strange and very abbreviated. But Brendan, what's your Twitter handle? Where can people find you?
It is at Brendan Morty because Twitter does not like my full name. It thinks it is way too long. So I have shortened it for the people.
Couldn't agree more. Of course, give him a follow. We're going to have Jim Palmer coming up around the corner. Brendan, thanks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now we're joined by Hall of Famer and, of course, MASN broadcaster Jim Palmer, who joins us via Zoom. Jim, thanks so much for hopping on.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. I'm out here in California. We have June gloom. It doesn't clear off. If it does, till about 1 o'clock. But the gloom seemed, if you're a baseball fan, to fade away yesterday when finally the owners and the players came up with an agreement.
Yeah, it's a perfect transition. What was your reaction to the news yesterday that the agreement was made on a 60-game season?
Well, let's see. I work for MASN. Well, about time. I think, there's I was a member of the union for years, and the union has done great things for the players. But I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, you're going to plead, the fact that you're not happy with the agreement you negotiated and you signed back in the winter of 2016 and 2017. If you're a player, or you're Tony Clark and you're the union leader, and I'm going, well, you signed it, you agreed to it. things change. Baseball's evolved. We know analytics play a big part. I don't think they're unhappy with the fact that Mike Trout, every time he plays a game, gets $222,000, or Garrett Cole is going to get over $1 million per start. Now that'll change because of the pandemic and the fact they're only going to play 60 games. But there's plenty of revenue, and I always thought that, that the most important thing if you're a player is what percentage of the revenue you're getting. I think it's dropped a little bit, but it's still about 47% in a normal year of about $10.7 billion. So it just seemed to me that they were trying to renegotiate the agreement they signed back in 2017. They had some leverage. I'm not sure we would have played that many games anyway because of the pandemic. I'm not sure how many games we're going to play because, as you know, through many states, hopefully Baltimore will not be one of them. You're seeing a spike in, COVID-19. So we'll see how all this shakes out. But, the commissioner had to implement, what he had the right to do, and they made that agreement back in March 26th. And I think the one thing that I look at, Paul, is that I was just kind of surprised that you would have language, if we play without fans, we will discuss the economic feasibility, such a nebulous clause in a contract between the players and the owners. And if you followed baseball, all the way back into the 70s and the 80s, they don't always like each other. And I think that this is one of their moments. So hopefully they'll like each other for the next 60 games and then the playoffs. And, we'll see where this goes.
Jim, you were a player during some work stoppages, of course, during your career. Back in 1981, a work stoppage ended up crushing 40% of the season in the middle of the year. But did you get any kind of flashbacks to that 1981 season while all of this talk was going on?
Well, of course, I think, you make a good point that when the strike started, I'm not sure it was the end of May or early June, it went for like 52, 53 days. We had already gone to spring training. Spring training back then, you'd get 7 starts, you'd probably pitch 40 innings. You'd be ready to pitch extra innings opening day. Not many of the Oriole pitchers got as many innings, I think, as they would have liked this year. I think, Chris Davis was, the hitters, a lot of times you'd talk to hitters after 2 weeks of spring training, and they say, hey, I'm ready to start the season. Pitchers, a little bit different. And that's why this, whatever it's going to turn out to be, the 20 or the 21 days of summer trainings, it used to be spring training, now it's going to be summer training, is going to be important. It'll be very interesting. They're going to have expanded rosters. They're talking about for the first 2 weeks, 30 players, then dropping to 28. And then you go back to what they were going to have for the first time. Well, not the first time, but the first time in recent yeyears where they were actually going to have a 26-man roster. So, how you deploy your players, Paul, you read it probably as much as I do. They're saying, well, usually baseball season's a marathon. Well, this is going to be a sprint. There's going to be 60 games. You're not going to have the 16 teams or whatever they wanted in the postseason because they couldn't come up with that as part of the agreement. But I think what we're going to see is, the team that probably has the best bullpen, maybe some of the intermediate pitchers, because I think a lot of times you're going to be like spring training. I don't know what the pitch count will be. I would imagine they'd be able to throw more than 30, 35 pitches, maybe the first time out, but, they'll be doing simulated games. And I think it's interesting. You talked about 81. I never missed a day. And it took me almost another month to get back to where I was able to, I think I'd beat Milwaukee and the Yankees the last 2 games. And I was at least, we had a good team. We had one of the better records, but because they split the seasons, we didn't go to the postseason that year. But at least it gave me some kind of impetus to get ready for 1982 and one of my better years that year.
Well, it's good that they will have some time, at least for a spring training 2.0, to get themselves back in shape. For some of the non-contending teams, the Orioles, of course, being one of them, with 60 games, you never know, but assuming that the Orioles are not in the playoff race by the end of the year, how do you see this affecting a team like the Orioles? We still haven't any official word about the minor league season, but potentially being canceled altogether. How do you see all of these changes between the shortened major league season and the potential canceled minor league season affecting the O's?
Well, I think, they have so many young players. They also, if you look at last year's roster, Hanser, Alberto, he almost hit 400 against lefties. You wanted to see, I don't know if he, can do that again. I think he had 398 against left-handed pitching, 230 something against right-handed. So I think you wanted to find out, is he a platoon player? or can he hit close to 300 again? People forget that Renato Nunez hit 31 home runs last year. Now we all know it was, the most home runs in the history of baseball. We also know it's a game where, hit more home runs and strikeouts is all right for the second consecutive year. You had more strikeouts than base hits or something like that. So the game has changed a little bit. I think, Santander, he hit 20 some home runs or 20 home runs. He looks like he's probably a better corner outfielder. But at the end of the day, you wanted to see a lot of the young players get at bats. I know John Means, great first half, had some shoulder problems in the second half, didn't pitch quite as well, made the All-Star team. Okay, is he the real deal? Can he stay a little bit healthier? I think a lot of it, he falls off a little bit, put some stress on that shoulder. So I think all these things, Alex Cobb, he's got 2 more years on his deal. I know the Orioles would love to trade him, but the only way you would trade somebody like Alex is if he gets back on the mound, able to get his innings in. So there were a lot of, Asher. He had some great games. One of the best games I saw pitch last year when Wojciechowski, he just dominated the Red Sox, and they had a pretty good offense. Mookie Betts wasn't a Dodger; he was playing for the Red Sox. So, a lot of questions. Michael Gibbons, one of those guys you thought he was going to be traded every week towards last year. Didn't have a great spring, but he's one of the mainstays. Tanner Scott pitched a little bit better. Cody Carroll was part of the trades we made back in 2018. Great spring. So there were all these things that I think we were all kind of looking forward to see if these guys are for real. I know a lot of managers, a lot of scouts will tell you, well, you don't believe what you see in the spring training, but I'll tell you what, it's better if you're trying to make a ball club to have a good spring than have a bad one. And we had a lot of young players that actually were playing well. And I think collectively, Paul, you make a good point. Orioles played pretty well this spring.
Yeah, and of course we could see some wonky stats come out of a 60-game season, maybe some records broken. I went back and I looked at one of your Cy Young seasons, 1975. Through the first 60 games of that season, you had 11 wins and a 1.64 ERA. That would have won you Cy Young through 60 games, whether it was then or by the end of a 162-game season. Do you think we could see some strange stat lines that resemble that one from 75?
Well, I would imagine so. I think it's, you have, let's now, because we're, going to play all the teams, 10 times in the American League East. So that's 40 games, and the other 20 would be National League East teams. So we're going to see the Nationals. The Nationals record after 60 games last year was 27-33. Yeah. They won the World Series. So, so things weren't going exactly the way that they wanted them to go. But of course they turned it around. Dave Martinez, in what is the second or third year of managing, he kind of, settled the troops, and they have a very good pitching staff, and they have some guys that certainly can play. Rendon, of course, now is an Angel. So at the end of the day, you can have a lot of stuff. But like I said, I think that, normally I learned on teams that won 109, 108, 101 games, teams that usually were, when we went to spring training, we thought we could end up in the postseason. We always knew a game in April meant as much as one in September. Because I think a lot of times fans say, hey, well, it's all, matters what they do in the stretch. Well, games you win in April. So now it's going to be, what kind of games do you win in late July and early August? We used to always say August, the dog days of summer. Well, the season's just going to be revving up. So I just think managers will probably manage a little bit differently. But then, you want to win, but you also want to protect your players because of, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, the fact that, they've had 3 months off. Probably the last official workout was March 13, 14, somewhere in there. So I think Tampa maybe did a little bit of a workout a couple of weeks ago. But a lot of the teams have, I think all the teams have had to close their either their minor league facilities and so on. So it's going to be very interesting. And, like I said, it's kind of like a sprint. It's a dash. It's not going to be a marathon.
Yeah, and you mentioned the world champion Washington Nationals not making the playoffs. At the end of this season, we're going to have a World Series champion if the coronavirus allows them to play a full season. How legitimate would a champion out of this 2020 season be considered, all things considered, with the shortened season and whatnot? Would it be a legitimate World Series title?
Probably more legitimate than the one the Astros won in 2017. So there you go. But, the rules are the same for everybody. So the point is everybody's going to play 60 games. Some schedule is going to be a little more different depending on what division you play in, and where your interleague games are going to be played. If you look, the Mets, of course they lost Syndergaard, but they got Alonso, who led the National League in hitting, so the Orioles will see him. Atlanta's into the division, I understand, so they're primed. The Nationals are defending world champions. The Phillies, you got Bryce Harper, you got Ram Muto. there are a lot of good teams. So I'm not sure that playing against the National League East is the best of all worlds, but it's pretty much equal for everybody. So, I just think, the interesting thing to me is that, everybody said, well, it's not about the money, it's about the ring. Well, because of the negotiations and because the players would not accept what the owners want, there is not going to be the World Series share for the players is based on attendance. And there's a good chance you may not have anybody watching the games other than on television. So that wasn't, from far as I can see, part of any negotiation. So you will not be getting a postseason check or a World Series check. And if you're a young player or you're a coach or, maybe you're a clubhouse guy that, we used to be very generous with our guys because we knew that, it made a big difference in their lives. They're not going to be getting that check. So it's maybe a little bit different pot at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. But a world championship is the world championship. And, I think it will be legitimate. And like I said, most people thought the commissioner should have taken away the Astros world championship. This one's going to be at least hopefully equal for everybody.
Yeah, well said, Jim. Before we get you out of here, I do want to get your thoughts on the draft, which took place a couple weeks ago. The Orioles shocking the world, as it seems, taking Arkansas outfielder Heston Kjerstad with the number 2 overall pick. What do you think of Kjerstad, and what do you think of the Orioles' overall draft class?
Well, I think, anytime in my era, I was, McNally, Davey Johnson, Andy Etchebarren, myself, we were all a couple of years before the draft. So, it was, okay, we're going to get these guys bonuses, which is what's happening now. Of course, because the Orioles only won 54 games last year, they got the second pick behind the Tigers. I think most scouts thought that they would probably pick Austin Martin out of Vanderbilt. He goes to Toronto. So now they even have more young, good players. But, Kjerstad, I looked at some, it's funny, I was reading all the stuff when most people thought they were not going to take Austin Martin and they were going to go with maybe somebody else because it would allow them maybe to sequence their way, because they had almost, $14 million worth of bonuses they could distribute over the first really 5 rounds with 6 players. So, I'm looking, and everybody described him to Todd Helton, but I was looking at some film yesterday. And, this kid, now it's aluminum bat. Keith Hernandez ended up having a pretty good career, but he was a first baseman. Heston's an outfielder, most likely would play right field. And, I read some things where he improved defensively. And if you're going to take a field at Camden Yards, even though you only play half your games there, right field at Camden Yards is probably the easiest field to play. Chris Sabo was a second baseman, and Johnny Oates put him out in right field once. And I said, hey, have you ever played right field before? He said, no. And I said, how are you going to play it? He said, well, I'm going to turn around and play it off the wall. So it's maybe a little more complicated than that. But, I think the thing that we're talking about is that they got probably the best left-handed bat in the draft. Now, I read all the stuff where they thought they might be able to, get a young pitcher. I think Visco, Pennsylvania high school kid, before they got, to the second choice. He went with Tampa Bay, I think 24th, because you got to understand Tampa Bay, the Orioles aren't the only team that has really good analytical. Tampa Bay probably exceeds what most people think every year. They won well over 90 games the last 2 years. So, they took this young kid. And, but, I think, Kjerstad has a chance to be a great player. And, Camden Yards. And so when I'm watching the film yesterday, it's a home run down the left field line on a high breaking ball. He slams a home run. He hits flares. He hits check swings. He hits ground balls. It looks like he runs. It looks like I don't know how big he is, maybe 6'2", 6'3", probably will get bigger when he gets, even not that college programs don't have good weight rooms and things like that, but he'll probably mature. And then, he has, the Orioles have made a lot of inroads in helping their young hitters with, swing analytics and whatever. At the end of the day, you still have to figure out how you pitch and hit against Verlander and Cole and, things like that. But at the end of the day, I think they probably made a good pick, and maybe it allowed them to get 5 other maybe a little bit better players than they would have been able to afford.
Absolutely. Always great to hear your thoughts on the draft, on the season coming back in 2020, and hopefully we get to hear you on some MASN broadcasts at some point soon. Jim Palmer joining us here. Can't thank you enough, Jim.
Oh, my pleasure. Take care. Be healthy.
You too.
Stay safe.
That's all we got for the MASN All Access Podcast today, which of course is brought to you by Marymount University. Visit MarymountSaints.com to learn more about our student athletes and programs today. Thanks to Bren Mortensen, Bobby Blanco, Hannah Broder, and the Hall of Famer Jim Palmer for joining us here on the podcast today. I'm Paul Mancano. Baseball is back. Let's celebrate. And of course, be sure to stay locked on to MASNsports.com for all your news as Spring Training 2.0 gets ready to get going. We'll see you later.